Hello, and thank you for having me today. I'm happy to be presenting on a flow action that I created called Validation Checker. First, a little bit about myself. I'm a technical architect at Gears CRM. We're a Salesforce consulting partner. I'm a Salesforce MVP, 5-time certified. I'm a regular contributor of this component and many others to unofficialsf.com. I have my own blog at Eric's Playground, and you can reach me on Twitter at eSmith35. And feel free to reach out anytime. So what I want to talk about today is what happens when a flow hits an error when it's trying to create or update a record. So this is what typically happens. You get an unhandled fault has occurred in this flow. And that's what the user sees if an error occurs that isn't trapped or otherwise processed in your flow. And then you also get this fairly confusing email in your inbox that says you had an error and gives you a little bit of information on what was going on in your flow when that occurred. What I want to show you is how do we come up with a way that we can avoid these type of errors and have a better way of handling or processing these. So let's start and look at what could cause something like this. Do you ever have users that enter invalid data on your flow screens? Could they be entering more characters than a field allows? Could they be tripping a validation rule? If you have required fields, have they left a field empty that turns out it should have been required? Are they bypassing a lookup filter? If you're creating records, are they entering duplicate records? These are all things that you can have in your flow and could cause an error to occur if the user put these in. So do your users ever do this? No, didn't think so. So thank you for having me, and have a good conference. Oh, wait a minute. My users do this sometimes, and I think there's a good chance that your users do too. So let's take a closer look. And I'm going to demonstrate how we can avoid these errors and what happens when you have them. Let me find the right screen here. Okay, so here's a flow where I'm selecting a record, I'm getting that record, I'm presenting a screen to change some fields, I assign those fields, and then I want to write my record back out. So I'm reading a record in, I'm letting the user make some changes to some fields, and then I'm saving those changes. Pretty straightforward. So if I run this particular flow, first it's going to ask me for an account, so I'll select an account. And now it's asking me to update some fields. So I'm going to put in, I need an integer value here. So I'm going to put in the number 7, and we're going to put in some other values. And we're going to click next. When I click next, it's going to go and save those changes. Well, wait a minute, something happened here. I got that unhandled fault occurred in the flow. So that's not a really good experience for the user right now. That's the flow is stopped. They can't continue on, and this is all they see. You as the admin, you can go, you can take a look, and you got this email that came in that says, hey, there was an error. It was a validation exception on a custom field. So to give a better user experience, you really should have trapped that or somehow allow for that in your flow so you wouldn't have this type of error. So if we go back to this flow and run it again, we might, let's just try it one more time. Let's go out of that. We'll go back into the flow. Let's run it again. And I'm going to fix that error that I had. Yeah, I put a value in here of a number 7. So let's put in some more updates as the user. I don't need a value there. I'm going to go and click next and go save. I've got an error again. This time, let's go back. See what happened. We'll take a look at my emails. We'll open up the latest one. I had a required field that was missing. So this can go on and on. You can have these type of errors that are occurring. So let's take a look at some of the things that could cause these type of errors. If we look at the account record itself and how we have that set up, we had an example here. Let's take a look. It could be something as simple as you have a required field. And if you don't have a value for that in your flow, and you try and change a record or create a record without a value there, it will cause an error. You could also have things like validation rules can cause errors. I've got a couple validation rules here. I've actually seen orgs out there where there are dozens and dozens and dozens of validation rules, all active, that could all affect or possibly cause an error if the flow did not allow for those. Lookup filters are another thing that could cause a flow error. Other things that could happen, you have duplication rules. Here's a common one. Let's take a look at this field here. This is a text field that has a length of 10. And if you do a text input in a flow, you can't really specify the number of characters that a user can type in. So they could easily type in 11 characters or 40 characters. And if you don't trap that or allow for that, your flow will exit out with that unhandled fault error message. Again, this is not something that you want to see when you're running your flows. So how can we avoid this in your flows? What can you do as the person creating these flows to keep these types of errors from happening? There's a few different ways. Let's look at option A. I'm going to give you option A, option B. So option A, and this is pretty straightforward. What you can do is all of those validation rules that you have is you can reproduce those validation rules in your flow. So you define a validation rule in the object manager when you set up the object, and you can go and you can redo all of those validations, all of those formulas, and put those in your flow. But to keep in mind though, when you are doing a validation rule on an object, I think it has to be negative. But when you're checking a validation in a flow, it's got to be positive. So you got to kind of reverse your logic when you do that. But you can reproduce all of those validation rules. And you should also go and check every single text field to make sure that you're not exceeding the maximum number of characters that you've defined in your object. The flow can do that. You can add a loop and just look at records and then see if there's a duplicate record already in there. You can go through all your records and make all of those checks, do that in your flow. You can make sure if any fields are required, that you don't have empty values or null values for those entries. So these are all things that you as the person building the flow can put in your flow. And one thing to keep in mind is you need to do this on every single flow that you have that interacts with that particular object. And then you need to make sure you're going in and you're updating all of those flows every time your object configuration changes. So I've seen people that follow these steps, they do this, and it's a lot of administration. It's a lot of work to keep things maintained in two different places and in all your flows and in your object manager to keep all of these things in sync. Now, option B is another way that you can do this, and that's just add this validation checker flow action to your flow and let this go out ahead of time and check, are there any errors? And it'll tell you if there are any errors, and then you can decide in your flow how you want to react to those or act on those. So a couple different ways you can use this in your flow is if you are entering values, you're assigning them to fields, before you go and do that update record, you want to check the validation. So you call the action, you pass it the record that you're going to be updating and say, check the validation first. And what this action will do is it'll return a value that will tell you whether or not there are any errors. And you can put a decision in your flow to say, well, if there are no errors, go on, save my updated record or make my changes, and we're good to go. If there were errors, you can have a different path in your flow. You can display those errors to the user. You can determine how you want to process those. So you have the ability in your flow to act upon the results of that validation. So this will, as we looked at before, this will check a number of different things for you all automatically. It'll look for validation rule errors. It'll look for fields that have more characters than the maximum number of characters you've set up. If a value doesn't match a lookup filter, if it has a violation there, it'll trap that. Required fields, if you're missing a required field, it'll trap that for you. And you can optionally have it go out if you're creating new records to have it check for duplicates before you try and commit those to the database. And this is all can be done before you would do something in your flow that would actually cause the flow to fail with that unhandled fault. So you get to determine what you want to do next and what information you want to present to your user. Another way you could use this is you could put it after an error would have occurred as well. So you could put this action in your fault path. So if you did have a fault, say when you were trying to create a record, as we see here in this flow, you can then have it in your fault path to get more information then that you can present back to the user. So you can use this validation checker action even after the fact in your fault path to go and say, okay, what were the errors? Send them back to the flow so I can let the user know exactly what happened and why we followed the fault path in this particular flow. Here's another example, another way you can use this action in a flow. And we'll get into this. I'll actually go into this flow a little later and show you exactly how it does it. But basically what we're doing here is after we get input from the user and before we try and do an update, we do the validation checker. Then we have a decision, were there any errors or not? If there are no errors, we can follow one path in the flow. If there were errors, in this case, I'm taking that error message and I'm going to pop it up to the user as a toast message using another action that's available on unofficialsf.com. And then I will present a screen with a couple of buttons that say, do you want to try again? Or are you just going to exit out at this point? So we have another decision at that point saying, what does the user want to do? Do they want to continue on and try again? If so, we go back to that original screen and we try and get the information again and go through that whole process. If there's decide at this point that they're done, they want to exit, then we can take a different path in that flow. So this is a couple of quick screens showing this particular flow in action. Here's the flow here where we're asking for information from the user. If they put in something that's invalid, it pops up that error message as a toast message and presents a couple of buttons here. Do you want to try again or do you want to exit? So how do you actually use the flow action? How do you put it in a flow? Well, you have a few different inputs that you provide to it. And you can provide either a single record or a collection of records as input. And you can also provide a field name. And the reason for the field name is if it's coming back and saying you have particular errors, I use that field that you specify here as part of that error message. So you know, or can let the user know which record actually caused the error. So we can make that identification by picking a field out of that record to use as part of the error message. And then I have a couple options. One is whether or not we want to check for duplicates when we're creating records. And the other option is, and this one's pretty interesting, is you can actually have this action do your record update or your record create for you if there are no errors. So you don't even need to put a record create or a record update node in your flow. You can actually use this action to say, hey, if there were no errors, do my create or do my update for me. And then you can continue on in your flow. So you can actually have everything done at that point. Or if you have errors, then you do something different in your flow. So the outputs that come back from the action. You have a Boolean field that's either going to be true or false. If there are errors, it gets set to true. If no errors, it gets set to false. And then your error message or error messages are returned back as a text string. And then if you're creating records, there's a couple other outputs that'll come back. One is the record ID of the newly created record, or the first record, if you're creating multiple records. And then if you're creating multiple records, you get a string collection of all of the record IDs for all of the new records, because you may want to act upon those later on in your flow, and you'll need those IDs in order to do that. So this on the left side, this is what the configuration screen looks like when you are trying to configure the validation checker flow action in your flow. Because this can act on any object, you need to specify or can specify ahead of time what the object is. Then once you do that, your other attributes come up. You have your optional attributes, checking for duplicates and whether or not you want to commit your changes. And then you either have an input record or an input record collection that you pass to it. And then that field identifier, which field you want to use, that's going to be part of the error message that comes back out. So here's a sample from a flow with just a quick screen that says, here's the value of the action that came back, were there any errors or not, and then the error messages. And so what we see here, I specified the name field, so it gives me the name of the record as well as the error message itself that's coming back. So let's actually go in and let's take a look at these in a live org. And I'm going to show you how some of these are done. So let's go back to this flow that caused the error here. And let's change this. So now instead of running through that, getting my input, trying to update my record, what if we ran the validation checker first? So we're going to do that instead. And we'll run this flow, we'll see what happens. So let's just take a look at what we're doing here. In this flow, my first screen, I'm just selecting the account that I want to work on, or which account record I'm going to be acting on in this flow. Once I make that selection, I read that record in based on which one was selected. And so I have the entire record available to me. And then the second screen, I'm displaying some inputs. I wanted to get some values that I'm going to use to change some of the fields in that record before I try and write it back out. And then after that screen, I make an assignment. So I'm going to assign the values from those screen inputs to the various fields in my account record. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my validation checker flow action. I'm going to say, take that record here's the record variable that I just updated. I'm going to pass that into this action and say, go ahead and check that for any errors, and use the name field to identify the record if you have to pass back an error message. And then finally, for this sample, I'm displaying in my flow here any errors. I'm taking that is error output attribute that comes back from this action. This is, were there any errors? And then I'll display the error messages themselves. So let's give this a try. We're going to run the same flow we ran earlier, but instead of triggering an error, we're going to have the validation checker trap those for us. So if I go in here, one of my validation roles was an integer. I said, well, this can't be a 7. So if I go and try and now update my record with that, it's going to trap this and say, yes, there were errors. That's going to be true. And it's saying for this account record, the test integer cannot be 7. So it's trapped that for me. So let's try running this again. We'll do something else with this. I'll put a value in here, and here's a field that has a maximum number of characters is 10. So if I type in, let's say, 15 characters. And then I try and pass it into my validation checker. It's going to come back and say, yes, there were errors. And it's saying the data value is too large. My maximum length is 10 characters. So this is coming back from the validation checker. It's trapped this for me and allows me to go in and do something else in my flow rather than exiting out with an error. And here's another type of error here. Let's say I have a required field and I don't have a value for it. We see it comes up here. It says this required field is missing and gives me the name of the field. So let's take a look at the other flow that we had here. This is the one where I'm going in, I'm getting an account. I'm doing something similar here. I'm asking for some values. Once I have those input values, I am assigning them to my account record. So I change those field values. And now I'm going to run my validation checker. I'm going to pass in my account record. I'm going to use the name field as the identifier. And I'm going to say I don't need to check duplicate rules here. I'm just updating record. I'm not doing any inserts. And then here is I had a checkbox there. Do I want to commit the changes if there weren't any errors? And I could either check that or uncheck that in this little test flow, and I'm passing that value in. And then my decision after the validation checker runs is I check did the output come back and give me an error. If it's true, I follow the errors path. If it's false, I follow the no errors path in my flow. So if there was an error, I'm calling another action, which is do a show toast. So I'm going to say, I'm going to give it a title of validation errors. It's going to be a toast type of error, which is that red box that you see. And for the message, I'm passing back the output that came back from the validation checker. So I'm just passing it the error messages. And then once that toast message is displayed, I have, this is using actually another component from Unofficial SF, which are navigation buttons. And this is where I'm displaying my try again or my exit buttons for the user to select. And then based on what button they select, I have another decision in the flow, which is which button. So if they click the try again button, then I follow one path. Otherwise, I follow the exit path. So let's run this flow. So I can put in some values here. If I put in my text field here, let's say I wanted to, let's say I'm going to trigger an error. Again, we know this field can only be 10 characters. And I'll say, well, actually make the changes if there's no errors. I click on next here. Now I'm running, I'll show you this later actually on an actual page. The one thing about that toast message, when you're running in the flow debugger or in the flow canvas, that action won't display the toast message. So we'll just do a try again here. Let's take a look at that. Here's the flow on an account record page. So I'm going to go and we'll try and trigger this here. So I'm going to type in a value that's too long. I'll say commit the changes if there aren't any errors. I'm going to click next and see now we get our toast message saying the value is too large. The maximum length was 10. Do I want to try again or do I want to exit? So as a user here, I'm going to try again. And let's go in, I'm going to fix this field. I said, okay, it told me the maximum number of characters were 10. I'm going to make that fix. I'm going to commit that change. Actually, I want to update that record. If it's correct this time, I click next. No, it still didn't like it. So let's try again. I think I might have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Let's try again. Okay, they said there were no errors that time, so that was fine. Let me go and actually commit the change this time with fewer characters. So if I type in a different value, that's valid, and I say I want to commit the changes, it'll actually go, it'll make the changes, there's no error message, and now my field has been updated. So again, this test flow It's just checking for any errors. If there are any errors, it shows me what the error message is with the toast message, and then I can either try again or exit out of the flow. Let's take a look at one other example here. I'm going to show you a flow that I'm going to test for some duplicate rules. So I'm going to have an input screen here where I'm going to get some information, and I want to add a couple accounts. So I'm going to put in some account names here, and I'm going to have the option here if I want to check for duplicates. So in my test flow, what I will do is I will take the values that I keyed in, and I'm assigning those to fields in two different records here, my account 1 and my account 2 records. I'm setting all those values, and then those records get added to a collection. The account 1 and account 2 get added to a collection of accounts, and then I'm going to take that collection of accounts and pass it to my validation checker. And right here, I'm passing in a record collection rather than a single record this time. So again, it's going to go check for any validation errors, any duplicate errors, anything that I want. And then based on that result, it'll show me the results here on the final screen in the flow. So let's run this and see what happens. So I have some field inputs that are going to go in these new records. I'm going to force an error here. We're going to tell it to check for duplicates. And I'm going to put in my account names. And I click next. And it's going to come back and say, oops, I had some errors. And I actually had an error on both of these records that the owner ID cannot be blank. So let's go back and let's run this again and see if we can fix that. So I needed to have an owner in here. So I'll select the owner. We'll check for duplicates. Give the same name. And it's go. It found another error here. I left out my missing required field. So let's go fix this again. So I had a required field here. I'm going to put in a value. And I'm going to make sure I select a record owner. I'm going to check for duplicates. And we click next. And it's going to say, oh, I had a duplicate rule error. So whatever I've defined for duplicate rules, in this case, I had the same name for two different accounts. This flow action is trapping that error for me. So let's try again, and let's try and get everything right this time. I'm going to put in a value here. I'm going to select an owner. I'm going to check for duplicates. And we'll put in two different names on these accounts. And everything came out fine this time. There were no errors. So I get a false back for that. And it actually created these two records for me. So it gives me the ID of the first record it created, and it also gives me a collection of the IDs of all of the records that were just inserted into the object at this point. So these are just a few examples of how this validation checker action can be used in a flow. And before we finish here, I just want to go, there are a few restrictions there. You may have noticed it when I was running these flows. And those are, if there are multiple types of errors, if you have more than one type of error, it's only going to return one type of error at a time. And the order it checks those and will pass them back to is the very first thing it'll check for is a field over its size limit. That's if there's any of those, that's the type of error you'll get back first. The next one is, are there any validation rules that you've defined that get tripped or triggered? Those would be the next ones that will be looked at and sent back. And then required fields, if there aren't any size limit or validation rule errors, but it'll check for any required fields, followed by filter violations, and then finally your duplicate rule check. One other thing is this action isn't fully bulkified, so I do have a limit in there as a maximum number of new records you could try and insert in a record collection and check for duplicate rules is going to be 150 records. Hopefully that won't be a limit of most interactive flows where you might be using this action. So just keep that in mind that there is 150 record maximum when you are trying to insert new records. So I'd be glad to answer any questions. Hopefully you've got some ideas of how you may be able to use this action, how you may be able to simplify some of the flows you have now, where maybe you're trying to trap a lot of these errors manually in the flow. Give this action a try instead. It's available on unofficialsf.com, along with a number of other actions, screen components, page components, and other things. If you've never visited that site, I highly recommend it. There's some great tools that you can use for building flows, and there's a lot of really good educational information there as well. So please feel free to go and take advantage of that. So again, thank you very much. More than happy to do this presentation for you today. I hope it's been interesting, and I'll be glad to hang around and answer some questions for you as well. So again, thank you very much.